Hello, and welcome to the second season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks and the co-chair of Literature Berks. On behalf of our entire committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of programs. I'm especially excited that my co-chair, Nancy Russo, is able to join us tonight on our panel. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and Sinking Spring Public Library and the Jewish Book Council. In the chat, you can see a link to purchase a signed copy of Hannah's War through our official book vendor, Reads and Company Bookshop. Literature Berks is happy to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. Throughout the event, feel free to type any questions you may have into the Q&A or chat function, and we'll do our best to answer questions throughout the program. Jan Eliasberg has had a glass-ceiling shattering career as a writer and director in film and television. She directed the film Past Midnight, starring Paul Giamatti, Rutger Hauer, and the late Natasha Richardson. Eliasberg has directed television pilots for CBS, NBC, and ABC, and multiple episodes of premiere series Nashville, Parenthood, The Magicians, Bull, Blue Buds, NCIS Los Angeles, among countless others. Handpicked by Michael Mann as the first female director on Miami Vice and Crime Story, Jan was director, writer, producer of NBC's acclaimed drama Sisters. She is known for nurturing superb performances from some of the greatest actors of her generation, among them Frances McDormand, Tony Shelbourne, Michael B. Jordan, Michelle Williams, and Stanley Tucci. She's had a prolific career as a screenwriter, writing films driven by strong, independent female leads. Wasp, the story of women air service pilots in World War II for Cameron Diaz and Nicole Kidman, and Meet Corazon for Jennifer Lopez at Universal. Her screenplays have been selected for numerous awards, including Film Independence Producers Lab, the BBC's Shortlist, and Athena's Film Festival's Best Screenplays about Female Leaders. A graduate of Wesleyan University, Eliasberg has 2 MFAs, one from Yale School of Drama and Directing, and one from the MFA program at Warren Wilson in Fiction. Hannah's War is Jan's debut novel and was bought in a bidding war and published by Little Brown. Hannah's War has sold over 30,000 copies to date and was just named a National Book Award finalist for fiction. I'm honored to welcome Jan to Literature Berks.
I'm sort of temporarily bowled over by that introduction. It's like exhausting. It's nice to be here. Very nice.
Thank you for joining us. So what was the inspiration about the book? Tell us.
So I've been thinking that it would be really good to have a new category of fiction that is something in between literary fiction and historical fiction. I think when people hear historical fiction, they usually feel that it's going to hew quite closely to the truth. That's not always the case. And some of the books that I like the most, like Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient, were inspired by the grain of a true story, but then just imaginatively fleshed out in a very different way. And I would say that Hannah's War is kind of right between those two. So the inspiration for the book came when I was researching the screenplay about the women air service pilots in World War II. I was at the New York Public Library in the microfiche room, so that tells you how long ago it was. And I wanted to see what the New York Times reported on the day that we won the war. So I called up the edition, and of course, as you can imagine, there was an enormous headline about the number of people killed, and Truman vows a reign of ruin. But then it was fascinating because this bomb had been dropped, but nobody in the world really knew what it was. It had been an entirely secret project. And so the New York Times essentially had to give the entire history of how this developed in an article on the day that it was dropped. And I was reading it, it was fascinating. And under the fold, there was a paragraph that read, the key component that allowed the Allies to develop the bomb was brought to the Allies by a female non-Aryan physicist. And I'm a feminist. I know a lot about unknown or erased from history women, but I did not have a clue who this was. And I thought that was the most important discovery of the 20th century. Who is this woman? But I also had this sense, very personal sense, that whoever she was reaching out of the microfiche and kind of grabbing me and saying, I have a story, you have to find me and tell my story. And it sent me on a mission that really lasted 10 years between the research and various outlines and drafts, maybe even more. Of course, I was doing other things during that time. It wasn't 10 years exclusively. That would be sort of sad, I think, or maybe noble. Anyway, I did find out who this mysterious woman was, and her name was Dr. Lisa Meitner. She was Austrian. She was Jewish, although her family in Austria at that time identified much more as sort of Austrian, actually Viennese professionals. They didn't feel that they needed to sort of identify that strongly as Jewish because it hadn't been that important. And so she was just not only a groundbreaker, but also really a genius. When she was 8, she would go under her covers at night and do mathematical equations the way we would read comic books with a flashlight. And she was so brilliant that even though there was no path and no encouragement for women whatsoever to go into mathematics and physics, she just kept sort of presenting herself. And people like Max Planck, really, really wonderful scientists, would sort of bring her along because they could not deny her genius. And so she ended up working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. And she was there in the 30s. She was there collaborating with a scientist named Otto Hahn, who was not Jewish, who was Aryan. And they were really partners. This was not like a flash in the pan. They'd been working together for 15 years. And as the Nazis were making themselves more known, all of her colleagues kept saying, don't worry, you are at this extraordinary university, you are at the top of your field, we won't let them touch you, you'll be fine. And of course, on the day that Austria was annexed, suddenly, instead of being a German scientist, she was an Austrian Jew. And she had 6 hours to leave the country. And actually, one of her colleagues was the person who told the Gestapo where she was. So no one stepped up to save her, although they did help her get an identity so that she could cross the border. But what ended up happening was that Otto Hahn could not work on his own. He had become they were so interdependent that he would do the chemistry and then he would pass the results of the experiments on to her so that she could figure out what had happened. And that was something called radiographic mathematics and then physics. And she was in Sweden, kind of in exile, but her nephew was there, who was also a scientist, and they were very close. And Hahn sent her an experiment that he was completely perplexed by. And she was, and I have to say, I love this moment because it's so cinematic. She was like snow skiing, not downhill, but cross country with her nephew. And all of a sudden she stopped in the middle of the woods and she started doing equations in the snow with her ski pole. And she said, I know what happened. We split the atom. And she coined the phrase atomic fission, nuclear fission. And Hahn, and here I want to try to be charitable because he doesn't really serve himself very well in this story. But he couldn't put her name on the paper that was published because in Germany, Jewish science, anything to do with Einstein was looked down upon and even dismissed. They wanted nothing to do with Jewish science. So we'll say, okay, so he published the paper without her name. But what is not excusable is that after the war, he was awarded the Nobel Prize, and she was in the audience. And in her diary, she wrote, "I am so disappointed that he didn't even mention my name." And when I read that, not only, I mean, I felt for her, but I identified with her, as I think almost any woman who sat in a meeting, had a great idea, raised their hand, you know, nobody pays attention. And 5 minutes later, a guy just interrupts with the same idea and gets credit for it and is lauded, and off he goes, you know, thinking that he did it by himself. So that just solidified my sense that I had to write about her in some form. And there was a biography. I'm not a big biography person. I'm a writer from my imagination. And I also felt that the story in Germany, the story I essentially just told you, was not enough, because by that time I had read more about the race between the Allies and the Germans to develop the bomb. I had read a lot about Los Alamos and what was going on in Los Alamos, which was fascinating. And I felt that that piece of the story was something I very much wanted to explore. I didn't really have a sense that that had ever been written about in a fictional setting. Hadn't seen film. There was a film about it, but nobody saw it. And actually, while I was writing, there was quite a good television show called Manhattan that nobody saw either. So I felt like, you know, the road was clear for me to go ahead and write this book. And certainly nobody had heard about Lisa Meitner. So I knew that she would be the center of the story. And then in reading about Los Alamos, I discovered that every one of the scientists was spied on, was wiretapped, was followed, for many, many reasons, but mostly because everyone was afraid that they were communists. And so Oppenheimer was tailed. His mistress was actually a communist, and you know, he went to her house, and there was somebody following him, and somebody who waited then outside of her apartment, like night and day. Oppenheimer's brother was a communist, so there was this sort of communist fear, but there was also the fear about spies giving secrets to the Germans and to the Russians. And I thought, well, that's an espionage thriller. And there's this very, very, very interesting woman at the center of it. And I developed the character of Jack Delaney, who is the sort of ambitious and hungry military investigator who comes in to find the spy and begins to suspect her for good reason. And then, of course, because, you know, investigators are far more interesting if they have a secret of their own, I gave him a pretty big secret too. And so there's a game of cat and mouse between Hannah, who was inspired by Lisa Meitner, and Jack. And it is through that interrogation that the story in Berlin unfolds. and I will just say, not to give any spoilers away, but the way it unfolds, it's not all true. I mean, you know, she's telling the story, so she's telling it to present herself often in the best light, or to prevent Jack from going any further. And so you hear a version of the story, and the next time, aha, something has shifted. And in fact, most people, everyone says that you don't know what the truth is until the very, very, very end of the book. So it's a page turner. It's a mystery. And I think it's pretty good, actually. I mean, you know, I'm a little biased, but, and it is, you know, a story about this very, very, very extraordinary woman.
And the real Dr. Meitner went to Sweden. Did she came to the United States then? She was the woman referenced in that article, or was it a different person?
No, she did not. The article was, I mean, the article was vague. Well, first of all, non-Aryan. I mean, it was interesting that the New York Times couldn't even use the word Jewish.
Right.
I knew what it meant, but also I think they were kind of stretching things because there was so much that they needed to report that they had to condense it. What really happened is that her discovery was the discovery that allowed the bomb to become possible. It was also the discovery that allowed nuclear energy of all kinds to become possible. However, there's a lot of work between discovering atomic fission and dropping an atomic bomb. And so it wasn't really that she discovered the bomb and kind of handed it over to the people at Los Alamos. It was more that she did the actual work that laid the principle and the theoretical discovery that actually made everything else possible. And what was very interesting, I did make the choice to bring her to Los Alamos. She did not come, although they begged her to come. I mean, she was a very, very gifted scientist and everyone wanted her there. But she was also a very moral person. And she actually didn't really want to have anything to do with building a weapon of mass destruction. So I'll just say that I brought her to Los Alamos, but I think I have remained true to her morality and to her spirit, even though I have, you know, taken it in a different direction than the real woman.
That's something that our book club was discussing about the morality with the science. Not only, you know, she was working in the book, Hannah is working for the Nazis and hiding her Jewish identity for a long time. And, you know, the morality of that, but also the morality that these scientists faced, that they were working with this brand new discovery, but they were also creating this deadly, deadly weapon, and the balance of that. And that was really a challenge, I think, for a lot of the scientists to weigh.
It was one of the things that attracted me to the story because I mean, in her writings, you could really see what she was weighing and what she understood. But in Los Alamos, it was a slightly different situation because there were, you know, 1,000 people on top of this mountain in the middle of nowhere. I mean, literally nowhere, New Mexico. And it was like a kind of summer camp for geniuses because they were the best scientists in the world, except maybe for Lisa Meitner and a few of the people who'd stayed in Germany, which is why they were concerned that the Germans and Hitler would get the bomb first. But they were all Eastern European. Most of them were Jewish. They all understood how serious it was, and they all understood that it was essential that they get the bomb before the Germans did. But they were also scientists. And so the excitement of discovery and the passion of being able to do your work with collaborators at the highest levels. I mean, there were stories that I love, like, they would walk into the men's room and somebody would scrawl an equation in the wood of the bathroom, and another scientist would come in and add to it. And so it was an atmosphere of incredible excitement. And it wasn't really until the test of the bomb was around the corner that people started to stand back and think, whoa, wait a minute, what? But I have to say too, that even then, they were torn between feeling like, we have no, what if it doesn't work? I mean, they couldn't test it, because by testing it, they ran the risk of blowing themselves up. So they didn't know if it was going to work until the test itself, the Trinity test. So they were ratcheting back and forth between, oh dear, what's going to happen? What are the ethics of this? And maybe we've failed, and maybe the whole thing will just be a dud. But I was also fascinated. There's a documentary, I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in this subject. It's called The Day After Trinity. It's by a filmmaker from San Francisco named Jan Else, E-L-S-E. And he managed to interview the inner circle of scientists that worked directly with Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was dead when he made the documentary, but his brother, Hans Bethe, I Robbie, I mean, all of the big guys. And they pretty much to a person said, when we won the war, when D-Day arrived, we kind of knew at that point that Hitler probably did not have the bomb. And certainly when Hitler committed suicide, we knew that he didn't have the bomb. And this was Bethe talking. He said, everything I know about myself and my sense of morality tells me that I should have turned on my heel and walked out of Los Alamos and never looked back. But I didn't. None of us did. So that also really captivated me. And understanding, I mean, learning math and physics was definitely the hardest part of this process for me, because I was not a STEM kid. I was a theater and English kid. But as soon as I realized that really being a scientist is about discovery, and about discovery of the truth, and it's exactly the same if you are an artist or a writer. You're going to follow that intuition wherever it goes. And, unless you're extraordinarily prescient and can really lift yourself out and be objective, you're just in tunnel vision until you come to the end and you've written your book or you've created your atomic bomb. So there was a group of concerned scientists who are now the Coalition of Concerned Scientists, they still exist, who were passing around petitions and who were meeting at Los Alamos to try to sway the government and the military and Oppenheimer to demonstrate the bomb. Bring, the Japanese diplomat, the Russians. By then, the Germans really, the war basically was over with the Germans. But bring them out to the desert and, give them this demonstration of the power of this thing and not drop it on human beings. And there was a real pivot. First of all, Oppenheimer was not behind that idea because he was terrified that it wouldn't work and that we would lose all of our credibility as the nation, the enemy of Russia that really didn't have what they said they had. But also there was a really key moment when FDR died, and it was very, very close to the Trinity test. And Truman did not know that we had this bomb. FDR was the only person in government who knew. So Truman gets promoted to president, and somebody just must have whispered in his ear, oh, by the way, we have a weapon that could end humanity as we know it. And he was a very different creature than FDR. And the scientists, I think the scientists understood that FDR was a humanist, even though he doesn't get completely off the hook in my book either, because he did some things that weren't so good for the Jews. But Truman was he was a lot more pragmatic. He wasn't a poet. For him, it was just part of his arsenal. And he was not interested in compunctions about, well, how many people will this kill? He was like, if we have it and if it can end the war faster, we are going to use it. And so that was also a turning point. It was like the bomb was in the hands of the scientists until it wasn't. And by the time the scientists realized what they had done, they could really no longer affect what happened to it and what decisions were made.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. One of the reasons I liked the book so much, you mentioned sort of like a spy thriller. There's a lot of novels, a lot of historical fiction coming out right now, a lot with strong female characters, but especially World War II historical fiction. It's all set in Europe, in the camps or right after the camps. And there's a lot of it that it's not that it's bad, it's just all sort of feels familiar. And this was completely different. And why did you feel like this was the story you wanted to tell and not necessarily the camp story or the European kind of focus story?
Well, I feel as you do, that story has been told, and it has been told beautifully, and it has been told so many times that I have nothing new to bring to it. I'm half Jewish. My mother is actually Episcopalian, but of course I identify. But for me, I wanted to tell the story that hadn't been told. I'm not that interested in telling the stories that have been told. One of the reasons I do write about women is because they're often involved in stories that haven't been told. But I too have read many of those historical fiction books, and some of them are impressive, some of them are, well written, some not, but it always feels like I have nothing new to learn here. But here's a woman who was a scientist. That's a completely different perspective. And also, what time she spent in Germany really addressed a question that I think we've all asked. I've certainly asked it of myself. If you had a sense of what was going on and how imminent it was, why didn't you leave? And I realized, because I had access to her diaries and also because I had to think as her, that she had not only a job, but a job that she had attained through 20 years of like backbreaking work. She had finally gotten to the top of her field, to the only place where she had been allowed to really practice her own best work. She had a collaboration, which any scientist who's collaborated with another scientist, it's like a marriage. And in fact, many scientists and collaborators are married because it's that intertwined. And she also, she did not, I've changed. I mean, Hannah definitely does identify as being Jewish, and she has not not first degree family, but second degree family. She is living and taking care of her cousin, living with her uncle, her father's brother. But they too are sort of looking for reasons to stay, in the belief that people are good, the belief that if things get really bad, our neighbors will rise up because they are good people. And I found, I had this feeling like if this were a movie, because of course I do think visually, like I don't want to see a Holocaust movie that's filled with Nazi flags, because it feels to me like that's telling the viewer or the reader, look at this, it's right in your face, and you idiot, why didn't you leave when you had the chance? I want to tell the story with the beautiful home and the lab and the collaboration, which becomes a little bit of a love affair, not to give away too much, but that there are real enticements. And I also think Weimar Germany was free and open, and a very, there was culture, there were cabarets, there were gay and lesbian bars that were absolutely open to the public, and the police chief even went to them. Lord knows why, but he did. And it was like everything shut down no, I shouldn't say very quickly, because that's not right. The Nuremberg laws were designed specifically to chip away in such tiny, tiny little ways that you didn't really see things changing around you. If you were a Jew, you could only go to this shop for groceries on, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Then you could only go Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. Then you could only go Monday and Friday between 10 and 11. And it got to the point where you couldn't go at all because Jews weren't allowed. But in the time that you'd been adapting to these changes and figuring out your shopping schedule, you were it was like the frog in boiling water. If the frog is put in boiling water, he dies immediately. But if the water's turned on and the frog is swimming around happily, he doesn't really notice that it's getting hot for quite a while.
Yeah, that's such a good point though about the career, because I think people forget that Jewish people, especially in Germany and Austria, the Austria Anschluss was a little quicker. Things happened a little quicker just because of the way it worked out. But like you said, the incremental laws in Germany just took a long time, and people had careers. To give up, you can be the smartest person in the world, but that doesn't mean you can translate your science or your career into another career at another, in another country. So, I think that's such a fascinating part that a lot of us don't necessarily think about. You touched a little bit on some of the diversity in Weimar Germany, and there's some diverse characters. Without giving away too much, can you talk about Sabina? Because I know she's a favorite character of a lot of people who read the book.
Yes, she's one of my favorite characters too. So once I sort of got the framework of the story, which is really like the plot in essence, and the three central characters, Hannah, Jack, and Stefan, who's her collaborator in Germany. I started peopling the rest of the story, and I love supporting characters. Maybe it's my director thing coming out, but when I see certain actors that always play supporting characters, it makes me so happy, because I feel like, if the supporting characters can shed light on the story in a different way, it just becomes a very rich world where you're not just seeing the hero's point of view. And so I felt that Hannah, because she was blinkered in a way because of what you said, as a woman too, she had attained a status in a career that was going to be close to her probably anywhere else she went. And I wanted also to show, and forgive me, those are snow plows, just if you're hearing background noise going down the street outside. I wanted to show that there were actual fighters. And Sabine being a teenager, teenagers generally think that they're immortal, and she's smart like Hannah, but she's also a little bit, she doesn't have the tether of science. She's a little bit of a emotional, like my daughter, who's a teenager. And I thought, well, this is actually a great opportunity to show somebody reacting differently to the same circumstances and seeing what's happening and trying in the ways that many, many, many Jewish children and German children did. There wasn't just the White Rose with Sophie Scholl. There were these groups called the Edelweiss Pirates, who just started as roving gangs of kids throwing rocks at Nazi, generals' vehicles and breaking the windows. But then they were recruited by older resistance fighters, and they started bringing food to Jews who were hidden. Then they started to be able to help Jews move if they were sussed out, moved to another place. And so they rose up to become real resistance fighters, just from being sort of, ne'er-do-well teenagers. And so I thought I really wanted to kind of bring that up. This story is not about Sabine, but the next novel actually is.
Oh, good. That was our next question. We're like, are you going to tell her story?
Because everyone kept asking me what happens to Sabine, and I thought, well, okay, I'll figure it out, and then I'll let you know. But it allowed me to broaden the scope of the book and of that situation in Germany.
One of the other things we were discussing earlier was gender, and did it help Hannah? Like, was she able to get something or get away with something because she was a female? Like, she was hiding as a scientist and hiding her Jewish identity, which was easier in some respects for a female than a male. But was there, besides the fact that you based it on Dr. Lisa Meitner, do you want to talk about like your reasoning for having such a strong female character and like what her gender, how it affected the story?
Well, she is not a woman who consciously uses her gender and again, I think these things through. So I actually have a female character who really does use her gender and her sexuality to kind of get things. But, Hannah is very much a woman who knows what her worth is and who knows the value of her intellect. She also knows she's the only woman in the room in those big, important meetings. And I think that she knows that in a certain way she's untouchable, or, well, that turns out to be incorrect, but that she has a certain place. She's by herself, she's a woman, she's attractive, but she's not playing that up. And I think she has earned the respect of all of the male scientists with whom she's working. I think that the military people on the base are probably like, what's wrong with her? She must be a lesbian, because why isn't she opening her legs? But forgive me, that was a bit crude, but the military was crude. And so I think she's kind of slipping by a little bit on, she's just there. It's only when Jack arrives and really starts pulling at the threads. And she does make one key mistake At the very beginning, it's before the book starts. It's the reason that Jack arrives there to find this spy. And that's the beginning of the unraveling. But it is a very, she's doing something that's very dangerous, but she's also covered her tracks very, very well. If that particular person had not been the one to try to find the spy, she might well have never been discovered.
I want to invite people, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A or chat. How did your years of experience as a screenwriter help influence your writing? Because this is your first novel, but you've had years of experience writing in other formats.
Yeah. I like to, I do say this in the acknowledgments at the beginning of the book, that every single experience I've had in my life helped me write this book. I started as a theater director, hence the Yale School of Drama, MFA. So working as a theater director and working with brilliant actors really taught me about character and about motivation and about character arcs. And character is action. What does a character want going into a scene? And what's the character hiding? And so, because, actors want to know, what's my motivation in this scene? So that was something. And of course, film directing forces you to think visually, because anything that is on screen, television or film, anything you see has meaning to the audience, whether you as a director intend it to or not. And once you realize that, you think, the stuff I put on the screen better have real meaning that I intend, because it will be interpreted no matter what. So I better have it interpreted the way I want to tell the story. So that forced me to think visually, but in a sense, it's not like, oh my God, I have to describe every single thing in the room or every single aspect of what she's wearing or everything that, or in the landscape, because that's not what film does. Film will show you something very close up, and then maybe you'll pull back and you'll see something big, but it's very, I think of it as almost poetic, like, here's this little piece and here's this little piece and here's this piece, and without anything else, you've sketched in a scene. And hopefully, if you've done it well, the reader will see it, will visualize it. And so even as a screenwriter, and as a screenwriter, you have to have a lot more economy than a novel, because the screenplay is 120 pages, mostly dialogue. Directors hate long description. I mean, as a director, I would look at a big block of description and I'd go, don't tell me what to put in front of the camera. I'm going to figure that out. And directors are routinely told to ignore like narrative, to ignore all of that. Like, she laughed, in parentheses. You're like, she'll laugh if I want her to laugh. She'll laugh if the actress laughs when we're, doing the really, really good take. So I became very sort of economic, but I love words. And so in economy, I would try to find the perfect thing to sketch in, the perfect word to describe it. And that translated to how I write. And finally, and I think this is maybe the most important, a screenplay and a film have to be structured impeccably. If the structure doesn't work, people will leave the theater or turn off the television, because things aren't adding up and they're not holding people's interest. So if the character starts out and the character is really passive and doesn't really have a dilemma, doesn't really want anything, you're not going to be that interested. So as a screenwriter, I spent an enormous amount of time doing what's called breaking story, which is what it sounds like. It's like taking your story and breaking it into scenes and then figuring out where the scenes have to go. And if I'm well, of course I was researching, so I would find little bits of research that would make their way into a scene, or I'd find something that happened in history that had to become a scene, like FDR's death, for example, and just scrupulously structuring and restructuring until I felt that it was like perfect. I mean, it's never perfect, but I felt like it sailed along. And I think that that's incredibly important. It's more important than novels than people think, because words are wonderful, but story is what compels people, story and character.
Mm.
And a story does not have to unfold slowly to keep you interested. Now, Anna Karenina, great book, unfolds pretty slowly, completely compelling. So I'm not saying this is true of every book, but I think it was true for me in this book. I think that I wanted the story to really, start quickly and grab you pretty much in the first chapter and just keep you going until the end. I love it. I love it when people write me and say, I'm so mad at you because I haven't slept. I didn't sleep last night because I stayed up till 5 reading your book. I'm like, yes.
Those are the best books that you can't put down in the middle of the night. Building on that, can you see Hannah's War as a film?
Yes, absolutely. I am right now in the process of writing the screenplay, in fact, because I can't say who, but I have a producing partner and an actress partner who are committed to making the film. So
great news. That's excellent. So Nancy sent in a question. She would like to know about the symbolism of the butterfly moth beret.
oh my God, what a great question. Okay. This is a lesson on what research can do. And also, it's a callback to my work as a director. So I knew it started so simply because I had an image of Hannah in the very first moment we meet her, which is the first moment that Jack sees her. And she's up in a lab, sort of behind a window. She's not really paying attention to what's going on. And I wanted her to have long hair that she never let down. It was always quite severely done up with a comb. It's a very European, hairstyle. And so for a long time, it was just this comb. And then I thought, oh, this is an opportunity. This comb could be important. So, who gave her the comb? I have an idea. So the comb becomes essentially a prop, as it would be in a film, that accrues meaning every time you see it. It's a callback to her time in Germany. It's a callback to the person who gave it to her. The person she says gave it to her isn't the person who really gave it to her. So, it accrues more meaning. Then in Germany, when you see it given to her, she doesn't accept it because she mistrusts the reasons behind why it's being given to her. She only accepts it when she starts to have faith that there is a meaning behind it. So of course, then I had to come up with a meaning behind it. And at a certain point, I started to do research into like combs and jewelry of that period. And I wanted to find something that wasn't a butterfly. And I was drawn to very sort of geometric, almost deco kind of shapes. But I knew that those couldn't really have meaning because they weren't really symbols. Oh, and so I kept looking and looking. I mean, I spent probably, 2 days just looking at jewelry of the period and what is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of that? And finally, I actually saw this very beautiful, very rare pin that Lalique, who was the great jeweler of the time, designed. But it was not showy at all, which was good because Hannah is not showy. And it's these two night moths. And they have a kind of like a shadow around them. They're very beautiful, but they're not, they're mysterious too. Night moths, I mean, they come out at night. We don't really see them. And we also don't think moths are pretty or beautiful. But in fact, they are, that many of them are more beautiful than butterflies. So then I started to develop a story about the moths. And then I had all the meaning I could possibly put into that one little hair clip. And I hope it works to sort of deepen the mystery, make you want to know, how it got there and why, and that you're satisfied when you finally know what it actually does mean.
So you touched on it a little bit there, some of the research, and you said that it took years. I mean, you were doing other things in between, but years of writing and research. So, how did you go about it? I know you said you read a lot of books on the time about, nuclear fission and different things. Did you visit places? What kind of process did you have, like, as you were going, or you did a lot of research at first and then started writing?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I think all writers have different ways of doing this. I did a lot of reading when I had, I had been at the public library and was told to go write this story by Dr. Meitner. And so I immediately started reading about her mostly, but it was very clear in reading about her that, atomic fission was the thing that all scientists were kind of working toward in that time, and it was going to change the world. So I had to know more about science, Los Alamos, Oppenheimer, the history of the atomic bomb, which is a book about this big. I've read it 5 or 6 times. It's a great book by Richard Rhodes, but it's a real doorstopper of a book. And then I wanted to go to Los Alamos, which I did. And I went there twice, I think. And the first time I was quite disappointed because it's still a working research facility. It's owned by, oh God, it's called the National Atomic Labs, I think. Anyway, you can't really get in to any of the buildings that are in use. They've torn down a lot of stuff that was there at the time that I was placing the story. So there are just a few things that they left, and it's kind of like a museum. You can see a little bit of this building, a little bit of that building. But then the second time I went, I had gotten in touch with people at the Atomic Heritage Foundation, which has been doing amazing work in collecting photos. They have a great collection of recordings. So I actually heard Oppenheimer speak, which just gave me such a sense of him. I mean, it was like, oh my God, this character is now I know him now. So I had made those connections, and I had also connected with a guy whose father had been working at Los Alamos on the mechanism for the Enola Gay that dropped the bomb, the atomic bomb. So he grew up in Los Alamos. So, I mean, he was very young, but he was there at the time that I was writing about. And so he sort of told me the things that he remembered. And so the second time I went, I was able to dig deeper and see more and kind of soak in more. And I did not go to Berlin. I wanted to, but Berlin is not really, I mean, Berlin was destroyed during the war, so it's actually very different now than it was at the time. I did go to Budapest, which is a very good, in film, it's a very good double for Berlin often. And I actually went to Budapest on a kind of scouting mission. So I went into different labs there, and I really, found a lot of visual inspiration. And then the research becomes more focused. So then I'd be reading for something. I'd think, okay, well, the book is going to end with the Trinity test. I've got to read. So now I want to read about the Trinity test. And then by kind of following the focus, I would find out all these little interesting crumbs about what was going on during the Trinity test, and I would weave them into what I was writing. So by the time I was writing, I had masses of research, but I also had ideas about, oh, this is going to be important, but I'm going to research it and I'll sort of fill it in later. So like the hair clip, it's like, okay, well, it's a hair clip, it's a comb, it's a hair comb. But I knew it wasn't going to stay just a hair comb. And a lot of things were like that. So it's a very organic process for me. I never stop researching. And honestly, if I find something amazing that I wasn't expecting, I'll just write it into the book because, I have the kind of mind, I guess, that can sort of, probably from being a director, you have to make decisions very quickly. So I will sort of grab something and think, oh, I know how I can use this. And, and then I'll just sort of, I'm just like a vacuum cleaner, basically.
We have another audience question. The book is a spy thriller. Do you read that genre?
I read Graham Greene. I aspire. I mean, I read what I consider to be great books and great writers. I don't read genre thrillers because I love genre thrillers or mysteries, but I read Graham Greene because he's about a lot more than just the espionage. He's about what happens to characters who are spies and the morality of what they're doing. And they're very deep and remarkable books that are also extremely beautifully written. I read a little bit of Alan First. And of course, you can't be a director in American television without doing all of these macho shows, not really spy stories, but, I know how to do chase scenes. I directed, the crime story I directed was about a Chinese spy who was in Las Vegas trying to get plutonium to bring back to China. And the detective falls in love with her when he shouldn't. And it's a classic kind of noir, film noir story. And so I sort of have that template in my brain, because how could I not? And I think it's a great form if you can do it well. Now, I would like to think that my book is a little bit more than that. I reference the English Patient a lot because it has two time periods. It also has a big mystery at the center, which is this patient who isn't talking, and what is his story, what's going on there, which is revealed very, very, very slowly. And I happen to love Michael Ondaatje's work. So, you know, something like that I would not call an espionage thriller, but it is a mystery. It's driven by mystery. And of course, Casablanca, you know, all those great war movies. And I certainly read a lot of those when I was working on the Women Air Service pilots, because that was part of my research. So I don't know that I set out to make it a spy thriller. It just, it evolved. I set out to kind of track down this woman, and then these other pieces kind of fell into place.
Someone's asking, you mentioned that you read Dr. Meitner's diary. Where was the diary housed?
It is, her papers are in Sweden. No, they're not. I'm sorry. They're in Germany now. She did not go back to Germany during the war. And she did not really, I mean, there's a letter that she wrote to Otto Hahn that she never sent, that was quite scathing about, a little bit about the Nobel Prize, but more about his complicity in staying in Germany and how they knew, she puts herself in it as well. She's not just blaming him, but how they knew what was happening, and they knew what that work was ultimately going to be used for. But Austria has kind of adopted her back, and there is, it's a university in Austria, and I wish I could remember the name, but I can't, but I can look it up and I can get back to you.
Sure, yeah.
There's a little statue of her that I love, because she looks like, when she got older, she looks like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, almost exactly. I mean, she's neat and she wears her hair up, but she is just ferocious. I mean, you just know that there's a brain and a fierceness in her that is not to be tangled with.
What kind of books are on your to be read pile?
I am taking a break from books right now. That's a terrible thing to say, but
I feel like it's happened a lot with the pandemic, though. I feel like in this time, you're either like, I can't read anything, or I'm just like, I need to be sucked into any book. And I feel like we've all sort of ebbed and flowed.
I read a lot as I was starting, as Hannah's War was coming out. And then I just kind of tapered off because I was, you know, doing these events. And when I did events with other writers, of course, I would read their books. So I read a lot of Holocaust books during that time, because those writers I was paired with. And I am reading some research books for my for the Sabine story. But I don't want to say too much about that, because that'll spoil everything. I'm reading a lot about what happened after the war, and how the Jews were essentially abandoned, pretty much, and how America, this is just a fact, how America embraced a lot of the top Nazis because the Nazis claimed to know what was going on in Russia. And as some of the Nazis ended up on the CIA's payroll. So it's a continuation of Hannah's War in a way, because I am interested in the morality of all of this. And this is, you know, we think the Nuremberg trials were this big, huge deal. I don't know. There were like 20 Nazis tried, and that was it. And there's a fascinating guy named Ben Ferens, who's like 102 now, who became the prosecutor of all the other Nazis, the lower level, like, after the big guys, and everybody else left. And he is kind of now on his own, working with, some of the people you would know, like the husband and wife team, the Nazi hunters, essentially.
Yeah, the Wiesenthal Center.
Yeah, all of that. But, and trying to get cooperation from the US government, and often coming into dead ends because it's classified. So I'm reading about that.
Great. Well, I think we'll end on that note. I'm really looking forward to hopefully seeing Hanno's War on the screen one day and reading your next book. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to remind people our next literature event is actually a kids event on Sunday. We have Jill Roshnader, who's going to do an interactive story time for kids Sundays at 4 o'clock. You can sign up on our website. Thank you, Jan, for joining us. I had such a good time. Stay well and take care. Have a good night, everybody.
Great question.